Hi everyone. I just want to say a huge thanks to D'Angela for organising this symposium. It's just been absolutely fantastic, and I think many of us needed some joy in our lives, and this weekend has certainly been a joy. So thank you so much. It's really been absolutely wonderful. Okay, so my name is Dr. Kirsty Fairclough, and I've been working in prints research for a little while now. You may have seen in the expo that mine and Mike Alleen's book, Prints and Popular Music, and you can see on the screen some of my previous publications. The Prints and Popular Music book is actually released this week, and you can find out more about it in the expo. And that book came out of the Purple Rain Conference, which was held at the University of Salford 3 years ago, and see some images there from that conference and from other prints work that I've been involved in. And the book has 17 essays in it from some wonderful writers, many of which have spoken already this weekend. So it's such a pleasure to have been able to pull this book together, and we've finally done it after 3 years. So for those people who are interested, you can find out more about it in the expo. Okay, so I'm going to talk about Graffiti Bridge as the film itself, and I want to start off with this quote, essentially. Prince said maybe it'll take 30 years to get it. Unfortunately, this doesn't appear to have been the case. For many, apart from perhaps us who are celebrating it in so many ways, that doesn't really seem to have been the case in popular culture more widely. And in this presentation, I want to argue that a reappraisal of Graffiti Bridge in terms of considering it not actually as a film, but actually as a set of music videos before a narrative film. So that's the kind of crux of my argument. And I'm going to argue that actually it sheds new light on the film and on Prince's cinematic world by considering Graffiti Bridge as not actually a Hollywood narrative-based film, but actually a set of music videos. So I don't think it's necessary to tread new ground here to really explore the narrative and the story and plot or lack thereof of Graffiti Bridge. I think we're all pretty familiar with it as a cinematic object. Unfortunately, I missed the narrated screening last night, but I hear it was lots of fun. So yeah, it's not really necessary to kind of talk about the story. But I think it's really useful to situate the film in the cultural context of the era in relation particularly to the prevalence of music video as a cultural form in the 1990s. So the music video has been a problematic and controversial media entity for as long as the genre or phenomenon of such videos to promote, accompany, or illustrate music has existed. So in the 1980s, then we had, we were used to the idea of videos of 3.5 minutes that were to promote a particular artist, and it was very much initially understood by some arbiters of popular taste to really usher in everything from the death of authenticity to the undermining of artistic worth of popular music to the eradication of its human element altogether. And that often happens when there's a kind of new form that appears in popular culture. There's a kind of backlash against it initially. However, the synesthetic combination of music and moving images has a considerably longer and much more diverse history than that of music television, and certainly of MTV. And I think a diversity that's only just beginning to be recognised in the emergent field of contemporary audiovisual studies, which is another area that I work in. So MTV then, as many of you know, began broadcasting in 1981 and became a dominant mechanism for the promotion and circulation of popular music. Radio, in this paradigm shift, was considered kind of unable to deliver the kind of full payload, if you like, and so it was like, oh, radio is going to disappear and wither away, as famously sung by the Buggles, who were the first music video to appear on MTV back in 1981 with a video Killed the Radio Star. So it was kind of commonly feared that musicianship, musicality, and even live performance would be rendered redundant by this new development. So the visual would ultimately, therefore, demand the reinvention of the sonic, and in the domination of vision over sound, it could almost be read as a sort of survival mechanism, only by transplanting popular music to the domains of the visual, no matter what kind of damage would entail. Would popular music continue to exist, rather, as an essential component of popular culture. So Graffiti Bridge appeared in this landscape, where Prince had become a master, actually, of the music, of the moving image in performance-based music video, as well of course, in music itself. It also appeared amongst the year's most successful films, which included those classics, Home Alone, Pretty Woman, and Kindergarten Cop. Very conventional narrative films in the classical Hollywood cinema mode. And the highest grossing film that year worldwide was Ghost, another structurally very conventional film. As we know, Graffiti Bridge was a box office failure, but perhaps this is only when it's considered as a conventional narrative-based film. If we reconsider the film as a series of music videos that are steeped in a high-concept postmodern cultural context, its significance can be reframed. Also, critics dismissed the film almost unanimously, and I just skipped ahead there to just make sure my slides were in the right order, suggesting that Prince's self-indulgence had in this, this time gone too far. So on both sides of the Atlantic, we had serious criticism of the film. In fact, it was widely panned. So this is from Empire magazine, which is one of the UK's most well-known review magazines, was back then in 1990. Incoherent, self-indulgent and incompetent in so many ways, Graffiti Bridge exemplifies all the dangers inherent in simply pandering to the ego of a pop star. Decent enough, albeit repetitive. As a songwriter, musician and record producer, Prince here acts, writes and directs as if these skills require no study, but would emanate from his very being on request. And on the other side of the Atlantic, the New York Times said, "We are talking major disaster here, the dynamite that's likely to destroy Prince's increasingly shaky reputation as a pop genius. Somebody stop him before he films again." Interesting. But this was not, this is not unusual. The types of, the reviews are equally damning virtually everywhere. There aren't very many reviews of that time that actually said that the film was anything other than a mess. So obviously the film was being judged against Purple Rain, Under the Cherry Moon, less so, but against not only Prince's previous films, but essentially against all of narrative cinema, with a very defined narrative structure, character arcs, and a visual style that's invisible, and it doesn't allow its kind of artifice to be revealed. However, this was 1990, and postmodernism as a cultural form had taken hold. MTV was in full swing, music video was the dominant popular cultural form. Graffiti Bridge then has to be seen within these boundaries rather than within a classical Hollywood modality. And I felt that very, very strongly when I've had to defend the film. I think it's important to look at it in a kind of reframe it in a different way. Obviously not just for us who, in the kind of echo chamber of, the fandom of Prince, but in terms of the wider appreciation of it. So this then, in this context, it calls for a different understanding of Graffiti Bridge, one that does not use the rather thin narrative arc, the badly drawn characters, the lack of acting prowess on the part of most of the cast as a way to evaluate its success. Rather, considering Graffiti Bridge as an essentially driven and dominated by music video aesthetics piece, it can be understood and reappraised in a very, very different way. So Graffiti Bridge then is also, as I said earlier, very much set within this postmodern cultural condition. The primary principle of the postmodern is the deconstruction of hierarchical oppositions. So God versus mortal, male versus female, man versus nature, mind versus body. These questions, of course, have dominated mainstream Western discourse. And it's these very questions of identity, difference, and intersectionality that Prince interrogated and unpacked throughout his career. His work appears to lie at the very heart of these ideas. And certainly we can, I've talked about this previously with Love Sexy, and I think Graffiti Bridge, quite clearly deals with these directly. And it's in its kind of addressing of the essence of spirituality as a means to transcend earthly woes. So this is a kind of essence of postmodernism, the idea that there kind of isn't any essence, that we're moving through a kind of world of signs and where everything's kind of been done before and is lying around as kind of cultural wreckage waiting to be reused or combined in new and unusual ways. And nothing is new, nothing is direct, everything is already mediated. So Graffiti Bridge at once conforms to and challenges these ideas in terms of Prince's personal mythos. This period was one where he really wrestled with those grand narratives and spiritual questions. The other aspect of Graffiti Bridge, which makes it a good example of postmodern cinema, I think I've gone a bit GIF mad here, so hopefully that's not too odd for you looking at this. So another way that it's a good example of postmodern cinema is its use of bricolage, or a collection of styles and approaches, which doesn't particularly work well in its entirety as a classical Hollywood film, or a Hollywood film rather, but as a film that's very knowing, that harks back to the past and looks to the future. It's very self-reflexive in that it very much highlights its own artifice through its visuals. You know, it's very music video aesthetic driven. That's why I'm arguing that we can look at it in a very different way. The sets look like they've been borrowed from video games. The movement between the interior sets and the occasional moves to the outside world are quite jarring. They're not seamless, as in a Hollywood film. In fact, they remind us that Prince's world has been brilliantly constructed in its entirety, and that Graffiti Bridge and the world in which the kid exists are also artificial. So I'm going to get rid of that GIF. It might be driving people mad. So as Carol Vernalis has argued, music video's avoidance of classical Hollywood film is a strategic directorial aesthetic. She argues that music video's embrace of a non-narrative trajectory is due to the genre's multimedia nature, the lack of appropriateness and applicability of narrative film devices, and the necessity of foregrounding the song's form in order to sell the song. So she says that while allowing for the possibility of music video to mimic narrative film conventions, Vernalis argues that music videos work against the concept of classical Hollywood narratives. And this really sums up Graffiti Bridge in many ways. Whilst it uses narrative-based musical performances, I would argue that the film works precisely because it's hung on the performances rather than any sense of it being a piece of narrative cinema. Essentially, the narrative logic doesn't exist. As cinematographer Bill Butler said, there was no script to speak of. He said Purple Rain was different because it had a script and some direction. As odd as this might seem in filmmaking terms for Graffiti Bridge to have none of those fundamental elements, it kind of makes sense on Prince's terms. So whilst Graffiti Bridge's visual aesthetic is quite lurid, quite garish and artificial, and recalling to some extent, I think, the aesthetics of the Sign of the Times concert film, Graffiti Bridge's deliberately synthetic-looking studio locations are kind of captivating in their knowing acknowledgement of the cinematic artifice against this kind of essence of postmodern media that I talked about earlier. And it's far from the sense of realism that Purple Rain exudes in many parts. So it's a long, long way from that. The very sparse flashes of the real world that are shot on location, you can see a shot from that here. They establish a quite knowing distinction between those two worlds, and they really mirror the film's most important binary, really between the earth plane and the divine plane that I alluded to earlier. So at the height of music video production in the 1980s, there was a tendency in some quarters to want to secure the pop video as something closer to cinematic art. Emphasis was placed on kind of lavish narrative elements and increasingly large budgets. And this is essentially how Graffiti Bridge functions with Prince himself, rather than an experienced music video director at the helm. So many music video directors in the 80s and 90s went on to have a career in cinema, or at least aspired to. And notable film directors of the time were also drawn to making music videos. So look at John Landis directing Thriller in 1984. That had an extensive use of special effects, costumes, prosthetics, 14 minutes long. There was a making of. So, Hollywood directors were quite keen to work in music video because it was, as I said at the beginning of the presentation, the latest development in popular culture. And Prince very much understood this. and in typical Prince fashion, took on the role himself and went further by essentially making a 90-minute music video. So the high degree of confidence within the music industry in the 80s and 90s meant that it was a particularly creative and experimental period for the development of the music video. And if you look at the camera work, the editing techniques, the performances of the singers and the dancers found in Graffiti Bridge, and we could have a whole day on this because there's kind of so much to unpack. Graffiti Bridge creates a very complex pictorial space, actually, in which continuity is often eschewed and focal points are quite fluid. So in Graffiti Bridge then, performances are often expressed as battles between characters. So Tick Tick Bang, for example, where Prince is expressing his inner turmoil through dance. And within the world of Graffiti Bridge, as I said, story and plot becomes almost an irrelevance because we're positioned to be absolutely mesmerised by Prince's performance prowess. And it was clear in the production of the film that the story was very much secondary. And as Bill Butler said, he said, like any musical, the story is abstract. He went on to say that there is a built-in audience, but Prince's fans are going to bring expectations to the theatre. They've seen him in rock videos, which uses slow motion, optical composites, solarization, every visual trick in the book. From Butler's perspective, he knew that he had to bring, my slides don't seem to be working. Oh, here we go. He knew he had to provide a very lush visual content that was not too far removed from the music video aesthetic. And what we mean by this is that we have very glossy visuals, we have lighting that enhanced the musical content, editing that was fast-paced and up-tempo to match the music. There are some scenes that have the texture and feel of a film, but these are very few and far between, and feel quite jarring when set against the hyperreal aesthetic of Seven Corners. In Hawkins and Niblock's book on Prince, they discuss philosopher Baudrillard's concept of hyperreality as a condition in which culture must continually replicate the real in order to stave off a cultural schizophrenia, where we kind of realise that nothing is authentic. What they mean here is that our cultural artifacts, such as pop music, are mass-produced, disposable and replaceable. And we must pretend that they have meaning and value in order to ensure their reproduction. So in other words, authenticity becomes just another commodity, something that's easily marketable and purchased. And this makes sense in many quarters of mass-produced pop, but perhaps it is difficult to dismiss authenticity out of hand when considering Prince in Graffiti Bridge. Here, his character might not be completely likable, but the energy with which he performs and the way in which he is shot cannot help but imbue the film with authenticity and an energy which transcends all of these missteps. So again, and in conclusion, the narrative or lack thereof does not really matter. It's the musical performances, essentially music videos, which make this film worthy of analysis, and not just for Prince fans like ourselves and Prince scholars, but when seen in the context of the music video-led, postmodern soaked culture in which it was made, that make this a key part of Prince's cinematic universe. So thank you very much for listening, everybody. And I think I have a couple of references just at the end, just for... there we go. Okay, thank you very much.